Hello, everyone. Wherever you are, thank you very much for joining us today for the Innovation for Cool Earth Forum 9th Annual Meeting hosted by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and New Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization. Now, let us begin the side event, Non-CO2 GHG Reduction. First of all, I would like to introduce the moderator for the session. Dr. Ismail Sergeldin, a member of ICEF Steering Committee, Emeritus Librarian of Alexandria, and founding director of the Library of Alexandria. And now, I'd like to ask Dr. Sergeldin to moderate the session. Dr. Sergeldin, if you please.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be with you, and besides being a librarian, I'm also former Vice President of the World Bank and former Chairman of the CGIAR and former founding Chair of the Global Water Partnership. And for a long time, I was also in charge of environment and agriculture projects in the World Bank, which therefore is very appropriate to the discussion we will be having today. Basically, what we are looking at is a recognition that the food and agriculture sector is contributing significantly to global greenhouse gas emissions. And more significantly even, that a significant part of what it is contributing are non-CO2 greenhouse gases, non-CO2 GHG. Specifically, more important even is methane, which methane is assumed to be almost 80 times as impactful in terms of global warming, but has a very short lifespan, which has led people to say, therefore, it would not accumulate a lot, and if we can significantly reduce methane right now, we can have a big impact fairly quickly. And examples of that have led countries to sign up for a commitment to reduce methane by 30%, and that's 100 countries have joined in that pledge, including Japan. So today we'll look really at very much that part of the issue, the part that deals with the non-CO2 greenhouse gases, as specifically from the food and agriculture sector more than anything else. We have three very distinguished speakers, all of whom know their material very well. The first will be Dr. Umaleli, who is the president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists in the world. She's been a long time senior person at the World Bank and the senior advisor, and serves on many commissions internationally on all matters agricultural, economic, and environmental. Our second speaker will be Mr. Francesco De Biello, who is from the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the World, to whom we all turn. And he is the man who knows all about the statistics that the FAO monitors across the world, and has been creating a way for decision makers to understand and look at these statistics. And then third, last but not least, we are very proud to have Ms. Chiga Yuki from JICA, who will bring us back to earth by referring to specific examples, specific projects in sub-Saharan Africa that were supported by JICA. Each of the speakers will have up to 5 minutes for the presentation, and then we will have a few minutes of discussion with each speaker, up to 8 minutes. And then I'll try to sum up again at the end in 3 minutes. Now, it's a little bit unusual, but as it happens, Dr. Umaleli fell sick, and she asked me to present her material on her behalf. So if the Secretariat would be kind enough to put on Dr. Umaleli's presentation. Thank you. So she is addressing the issue of pathways to reduce emissions from agriculture, and she points out that emissions from agriculture come from many different things, but more specifically, perhaps the most important part is that it is not just the CO2 that we usually think of, but it is also related to everything from the methane to the other types of gases, but primarily the methane. And the presentation deals with, therefore, the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. And specifically, we will look at methane and nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture and livestock. Why livestock? Well, because there are many reasons to believe that livestock is a major contributor to methane emissions. But there are challenges and opportunities for stakeholders. Now, when we say stakeholders and we talk about something like a sector that is food, nutrition, and agriculture, we are really talking about the producer and the consumer, whether public or private, the transformer, the transporter, all of the intermediate steps that go from farm planting to the consumer at the end, whether they are on the farm or in the city. And to do that all around, there will be some aspects that involve technology and in reduction of these emissions. And there is also a direct potential for such reductions in emerging countries, in industrial countries as well. And we want to look at, this is why it is so serious to look at methane. I mentioned it already, that it was 80 times as impactful as CO2. And the scope of our coverage will be to remind us of these reductions that can be done by dealing with the livestock subsector of the food and nutrition agricultural sector. In livestock, actually, India it has the world's largest bovine population, 110 million buffaloes and 193 million cattle. And it offers a huge potential for sustainability. And one of the reasons that is so, which perhaps is on the right-hand side of that slide, is that the milk yields that are across the board are so low, about 2.8 liters per day, compared 7.5 for crossbreeds, so that involve the better breeds and so on, and therefore 5.2 for buffaloes. The average global yield is over 20 liters per day. So if the farmer is keeping 1 to 3 cows or 1 to 3 buffaloes and is producing only 2.8 liters per cow or per buffalo, you can see that they're way below what they could be producing if we had better breeds and better activity. So increases in how the cows are fed and better programs will result in the productivity increases by at least 5 to 15%. And since we're talking about 2.8 million dairy animals, these are now under the ration balancing program, that's only 1% of the cattle population. So you can imagine that this is really very, very little, but it has huge potential. And we can imagine that this huge potential will rise and give us a possibility of having a big impact, because so much still remains to be done, even in that one subsector in India where we have the largest collection of bovines in the world. And the second point is that genetic improvement is the largest driver of future productivity gains in the dairy sector. So we did have a focus from the late Dr. Kurian, who organized cooperatives to get small-scale dairy producers into dairy cooperative societies, but we can probably do more. And the milk union and producer companies will lead to a better understanding, so we need to upgrade the overall impact of the genetic resources that we have to deal with. Then there is, of course, the methane from paddy production. Puddling of rice creates fermentation, and that produces methane. And the emissions of methane from paddy soils are concentrated in the irrigated areas, which account for 60% of the total rice harvesting areas, but over 78% of the emissions. And therefore, population, income growth, urbanization have resulted in increased rice consumption, and therefore there's more demand for that. But here we need to think, and we will be hearing from our third speaker on how community action at the small scale level involves irrigation and rice production with smallholder farmers in poor countries, including sub-Saharan Africa. So whether we can get consumption away from rice is another thing, but certainly we can think in terms of reducing the methane in the paddy production. And there are additional measures that she mentions, such as new crop varieties that better withstand climate shocks and improve yields, solar energy for product storage, and digital technologies that expand access to knowledge and services for the rural producers. And then no-till farming, agroforestry, and landscape management also support mitigation by sequestering carbon or reducing emissions. That therefore means that the poorest farmers can actually do still a lot for themselves, and we need to think about these additional measures as well. But in the end, we will need the proper enabling environment. I mean, clearly, there's no single formula that affects from the dry areas to the wet tropics, and therefore we need to have careful attention to all these problems and how to deal with them country by country. So I can only hope that Dr. Umalele feels that I have done justice to her material in presenting it on her behalf. And I would have some questions, but I would hope we can keep these questions to the end after our two speakers, because I think some of it will come back when we talk about the specific case studies in sub-Saharan Africa where they have smallholder farmers, and there's an irrigation case and other cases as well. And then we need to put this in context. So, in context, agriculture, the food and agricultural sector, broadly defined, which implies forestry, implies livestock, implies also aquatic resources, as well as the usual definitions that we think of in terms of farms and crops and cash crops as well. What we need, therefore, in that broad definition, we have a huge expansion of the contribution of the sector to greenhouse gases. Just how much and how much by different countries is perhaps a big question, but luckily we have with us the world expert who can tell us all about this in a very convincing fashion. And so now let me turn to our second speaker, Mr. Francesco Tubiello of the FAO, who has a complete mastery of the overview and the statistics of this important issue. Francesco, are you on? Mr. Tubiello, are you there? Please unmute yourself.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the introduction, and of course, yourself and the organizers for this invitation to speak. I don't see my presentation, so I'm not sure how I can provide information.
Yes. Can our colleagues in the Secretariat make sure the presentation is up? Yeah, that is.
Okay. My name is Francesco Tubiello. Very short introduction. I'm in charge of agri-environmental statistics at FAO. Basically, these are statistics that, if you're familiar with our FAUSTA database, are disseminated there and available for use by every users worldwide. We cover both traditional statistics, such as information on land use and input use, and other basic statistics which we collect directly from country, but also statistics on important indicators, such as greenhouse gases. Next. We do this to fulfill the mandates that we have from countries, first and foremost, to put out information that can be used as a public global knowledge base to assess trends in agriculture and food at any scale, from country to regional and global. But also to help our member countries develop better and better data. Data, of course, in the new data revolution is at the center of much debate these days. And so we are engaged in producing data in support of our member countries' need to report information, including in international fora, and in this case, under the Climate Convention. Not all countries being at the same level in terms of their capacity to do that. We are engaged in that process to help them get a better picture, first of all, to improve their pathways to better national data, and then at the same time have a picture they can use to communicate in international fora at the same level of other countries. Next, please. Now, in particular, we put out databases on emissions from agriculture of greenhouse gases from all the relevant gases. It has been mentioned, of course, we are focusing here on non-CO2 gases, mainly methane and N2O, but as you will see, also F gases, fluorinated gases play an important role, especially on the supply side. You just think about refrigeration, all the way from fishing boats to supermarkets. And F gases, if methane has several times, 30 to 80 times the weight of CO2, fluorinated gases actually have thousands of times that weight in terms of their capacity to warm the planet. Now, we think of non-CO2 gases in the presentation before, methane, as of course an important output of agricultural activities within the farm, and that's certainly true, and that certainly needs attention in terms of mitigation. But when we think about food and food systems and agri-food systems, you have to have a picture of the three components. Of course, there's many, but we group them into three. So those are activities on the farm gate, crop and livestock production mainly, but also things that happen at the boundary of the farm when expansion of agriculture is the main cause for destruction of ecosystem and loss of carbon. And then, of course, once the food leaves the farm gate, the entire process from manufacturing to retail to household consumption and waste disposal becomes important. Next. This just to highlight the richness of the data that you can find in Faustat, and I invite you to go and peruse and explore the database, and we remain available at our side, of course, to provide any answers and support to questions you may have in that use. But you see it's covering the, in this case, 4 main greenhouse gases, including non-CO2. It covers all the countries in the world, but also additional territories that are important in their own right, independently of being part of other countries. The important thing is that we have data in a time series, so you cannot just assess the status of things today, but in a sense, as any good statistics would do, assess trends over time and help us understand where things might be going next. And then we cover agriculture, but also all other sectors, because we also are in the business of relating emissions from agriculture to the total emissions generated in the world. Next. This is an example of the kind of granularity of the information that you can find in our data. This is an example for the world total, showing all the various components or the various contributors to the agri-food system emissions across the 3 components. So you see, starting from the left, basically going between the 2 light bars there, you get all the emissions they are generated within the farm. And those are, if you're thinking in terms of non-CO2 emissions, the ones, where the name of the game in terms of non-CO2 is mainly methane from enteric fermentation, as was highlighted by the presentation before, which plays a lion's share in total emissions from the farm. But then you see there also rice and some of those other emissions, especially manure management, but fertilizers application, then bring into play N2O, nitrous oxide, another very important and potent greenhouse gas, which has different mitigation strategies attached to it, because this is a long-lived gas, unlike methane, sort of the same order of CO2. But then as you move into land use, you start to appreciate important hotspots of emission. In this case, this is CO2, and what you see there is net forest conversion is basically a proxy for deforestation, which is the other largest determinant of emissions from the food systems. And then again, past the farm gate, everything you see on the right, there you get the various components, which in terms of this session, it's good to highlight. These are mostly CO2 arising from energy use, generated from fossil fuel combustion in the various processes, except that there are some important non-CO2 components. Retail has an important F-gas, fluorinated gas emissions due to refrigeration mostly, both in transport and importantly in the supermarket. And then waste disposal. You see there, the last bar, it's an important component of methane emissions. So mitigation along agri-food systems on methane rightfully focuses on livestock, but it has other components. Country by country, this may become more or less efficient to focus on those components. Next.
Okay.
As a result of that, you can see here a global picture of how those emissions relate to the total emissions that we emit in the atmosphere. Keep in mind that today, depending on accounting, we emit in total in CO2 equivalents about 50 billion tons. 15 to 18 are coming out of the food systems, and you see the grand total there, which is a very high number. I mean, if you think of food systems as a sector, this would be actually the first contributor, up there with
yes,
right after energy systems, of course.
Indeed.
And so you have a third of the total emissions coming from food systems, and therefore highlighting the importance to mitigating that sector. But you also have the information of how, where do these come from, and more or less these are equally divided into the three components that I have highlighted. Interesting picture comes when you look then at the single gases next.
Thank you.
Yeah, there should be an animation in this slide. Yes, there you go. Which highlight even more the importance of mitigating non-CO2 gases in agriculture. And as you see, agriculture within the farm actually becomes the place where most of the N2O emissions in the world are generated. So if your focus is mitigation of that gas, this information base tells you that you have to act on the farm gate in agriculture more than in any other sector. And same thing for methane, of course, with, as I mentioned, an important component beyond the farm, which is on supply, pre and post production part, mostly having to do with waste. And I'm closing.
Okay. Yes?
Yes. So final slide, just to highlight that the database provides a global picture, but it can also enable an analysis of country-by-country situation. This is what we put out as a sort of top 10 largest emitters. Of course, the largest emitters correlate with the size of the country and the population and the weight of their economy. And so this is granted in this graph. What's important, you see the three different components, yellow being crop and livestock, green being the impact on land use systems, and blue being the supply chain. So what this graph is showing you is there are different typologies in different countries, which then highlight the need for devising different mitigation strategies, but also highlights the growing importance of emissions from the supply, from post the farm gate processes, even in countries that are strongly emerging but still developing, for example, China and India. With that, I close my presentation. And
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tobiello. I have just one question for you right away, if I may, and that is, from this last slide that you have up there, we notice that a very large part, of course, these are still poor countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, etc., and China still come from the farm level, the yellow. And the farm level, again, these are usually smallholder farmers, except for the large combines in Brazil. But for the others, these are smallholder farmers. So the amount of transformation that is needed at the smallholder farmer is a particularly important one. That's something that our next speaker will bring to life with real-life projects. But before I move to her, let me ask if anybody in the audience has a question for either of the first two presentations. If not, then I think we should move directly to our third presentation, and I'm very honored to have with us, as I mentioned at the beginning, Professor, I'll call you Professor. No, you're not a professor.
No.
I'm so used to dealing with but it's Monsieur Xi from JICA, who has been working on a number of case studies dealing with sub-Saharan Africa, where that yellow part is very big in the graph that we just saw. The floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much. My name is Kayuki from JICA African Department. So today, let me explain some of our works through two cases in Zambia and Kenya. And can I show my presentation? Okay, thank you very much. My name is Kayuki from Africa Department of Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. The topic of my presentation is challenge to tackle to climate change in sub-Saharan Africa. First, let me overview expected role of agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. The figure shows sub-Saharan Africa continues to experience acute food insecurity. In this situation, agriculture should contribute to food security. In addition, the table shows agriculture is a major value-adding and employing sector. Agriculture should play a driving role in economic development. This effective role is specified in the national policy papers in many sub-Saharan Africa countries. So, when considering agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa in the context of climate change, we cannot ignore productivity. When standing at the perspective of farmer next, net value of agriculture sector per person is decreasing. In the background of this, arable land per person is decreasing while population grows rapidly. In addition, FAO points out that ongoing expansion of agricultural land use is constrained. Therefore, considering circumstances surrounding farmers, they cannot afford only to climate change. They need their own benefit, for example, profit, productivity to sustain their livelihood. Then, let me introduce two cases of JICA's work in sub-Saharan Africa. In Zambia, JICA has been developing community-based smallholder irrigation. Utilizing small river and wetland and water sources, we support farmers to develop small-scale irrigation facilities by themselves. The irrigation facility utilizes materials which are easy for farmers to get, like tree branches. Though the facility are soon to be broken in rainy seasons, farmers themselves can make new ones, so the irrigation will work in a sustainable manner. And after farmers are able to control water well, we support farmers to construct permanent weirs by themselves. As a result, irrigation areas have been expanded by farmers themselves. We achieved expansion of irrigation areas of over 1,500 hectares and valuable income. And now, we are disseminating this technology wider and wider with Zambia government. I believe this small-scale irrigation has achieved success, mainly because farmers can feel their own benefit to get water and improve their livelihood. So farmers will adopt new technology by themselves only after they can get their own benefit, like production, water supply. Next case is Kenya. We are developing water-saving rice cultivation, WSRC. The WSRC is a technical package. This is a yield improvement and water saving, and consists of intermittent irrigation, healthy seeding, and so on. In Kenya, there is river irrigation scheme, and one of major issues here is lack of water in dry season. We have been developing WSRC technology, and recent demonstration experiments in some areas show increase of yield. Farmers start to adopt WSRC, but we need more experiment and demonstration to develop technology and for farmers to understand the effect. In context reduction of non-CO2 greenhouse gas, WSRC can reduce methane, but a side effect to farmers. Intermittent irrigation prevents anaerobic status, which generate methane in paddy fields. However, reduction of methane itself does not bring benefit to farmers. In addition, it is difficult for farmers to measure methane emission. Through this case, I believe we should not forget that for farmers, their own benefit comes first, and reduction of methane comes after. So when considering how to tackle the climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, we should keep in mind that adopting new technology cannot be successful without agricultural benefit, from the perspective of both government and farmers. Adaptation to climate change itself can be on benefit for farmers, but mitigation cannot. So in order to disseminate mitigation technology, the one which contributes to agricultural benefit need to be more developed. At the same time, showing their own agricultural benefit to farmers is important. In recent years, the concept of climate-smart agriculture was proposed, and there are already some examples. This aims to achieve both productivity and adaptation or mitigation to climate change. So again, we should not forget productivity and income farmers when we tackle the reduction of greenhouse gas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this very important presentation. Let me just come back to you with one or two observations or questions if you want. I think a very important thing that you said in passing, and I would like to highlight it both for the audience here and for the audience online, it is that if you're going to reach these myriads of smallholder farmers, you have to address their needs, their benefits. And they're not going to change what they do just because of mitigation and reducing methane, etc. But if they see direct benefits in their own farm output, their productivity, prices, etc., then the greenhouse gas, the emissions side, should be a side product. And therefore we need, am I correct in understanding you that from JICA's perspective as well, we need more technologies that benefit the small farmer and also help with the emissions.
Yes.
But we can't come to the farmers and tell them, you know, you're producing methane. You've got to change it.
No.
So that's important. Now, do you also see good, in the cases that you explained, do you see good outreach from agricultural research networks? Most countries have ag research systems that bring these new technologies to the farmers, or not enough?
I think it's not enough now because the technology is there are many other technologies, and the one which suits to the situation is the different, case by case. So we first have to develop the basic technology, and then we have to adapt, modify technology so that it can suit the specific situation.
Okay. And then this next question really applies to both you and to Dr. Tubiello at FAO. In order to get transformative climate-smart agriculture, as you mentioned here, but also generally much higher productivity. We saw from Dr. Umaleli's presentation that the buffaloes and cows in India produce like 2 to 5 liters per day, when the global average is like 20. And therefore the number of cattle could be significantly reduced and still have as much milk, if not more, if they had better breeding systems and so on. And that raises a question. It's been suggested that both on the one side, with the new digital revolution that allows us to get satellite imagery that analyzes the conditions of the soil and water, and even in small remote farms that can now be accessed by handheld devices, we would be able to provide guidance for smallholder farmers in remote areas, wherever they are. And secondly, that the genetic revolution can assist in having plants and trees that will even consume more CO2, but more importantly, will have a bigger contribution to productivity and to helping the farmers. So from your side, do you see the combination of digital and genetic in some form being packaged in ways that would help the smallholder farmer? Would that also be a solution? And Mr. Tubiello, if you think about that for a moment, do you see potential, a significant potential, to reduce the yellow parts of the graphs that you had by such techniques? You go first.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I can see the very big potential on the digital transformation. For example, when we can target farmers and we can visualize the CO2 emission from farmers, I think it's very important. It can enable us to incorporate farmers to the market. They can visualize the CO2 emission and reduction, and they can get the royalty on the reduction. So I think it's the one way we can make farmers to change their practice to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, thank you. Now let me turn to Mr. Tubiello, please. Would you?
Yes, thank you for the question and very interesting suggestions. So I, of course, also see very much potential on the combination of the two areas of work. On the one side, let's call it precision agriculture at large, or inclusion of Earth observation data built into farm information. And the other one, of course, genetic improvements, but also improvements in management. So they will all contribute to this challenge. Maybe one thing I could add to the discussion is that, at least in principle, we've developed over the last 20 years, if you read any of the recent IPCC reports, what I call, lists. They almost look like laundry lists of things that we know work. By the way, many of the things that are good practices in agriculture not only end up reducing emissions, but we also know that end up increasing resilience. Things like improved soil qualities, which brings more carbon, but also more resistance to withstand extreme events. So we have a list of things that we know that work. What we're still missing today, perhaps that's where remote sensing would come in more increasingly, is what exactly to do where, because every place, as you mentioned, has specificities, especially the rural smallholder dimension has very high heterogeneity, and we need solutions that fit different realities, and we're not there yet, I think.
Thank you. Now I would like to turn to something that we haven't perhaps sufficiently addressed. Here is the question of the wastage. Agriculture for food and nutrition, which is now apparently producing 18 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That's apparently 35%, or maybe a little bit more, of the total emissions that we're trying to control. Has loss in post-harvest in the smallholder farmers, the post-harvest, where the harvest is lost because there's bad storage, there's bad transport systems, pests, and other things picketed, and that's as much as 15%. And then the wastage in this wastage, even in the industrial countries, where people we know buy food from the supermarket and put it in the refrigerator, and then they leave it there, and then they notice, oh, it says there's a date that says expired by, or better to use by. Oh, it's gone by, so they throw it away. And food from restaurants is not recycled. Whatever is left over is not allowed to be given to homeless people or whatever. So we have a situation, there's also potentially another 15% loss. Now, that's almost like if I'm correct in adding those two, then that would be like a 30% loss. Is there a way of significantly reducing both the post-harvest losses from the smallholder farmers and the consumer reduction in the rich countries? Mrs. Tubielo, do you have anything to like to say to that?
Yes, and thank you for highlighting a very, very important issue, which actually, in a sense, links all the dimensions that we've been addressing so far, because addressing post-harvest losses, which for the majority happen in developing countries, and therefore for the majority being a technical issue, which has been addressed by many different pilot projects around the world, including with FAO's help on improving storage facilities, refrigeration facilities, and so on, improving machinery during harvest. But also on the waste side, where in fact that's a component that it's mostly happening where the vertical integration of food has mostly happened, and therefore, at least historically, more in developed countries. But in any case, what I was saying, this link not only mitigation to efficiency of production and pressure on land, and therefore have incredible mitigation potential, because reducing pressure on land immediately takes off at regime that third of those emissions that I had shown in my presentation. But they have different ways to be addressed, I would say, largely technological on the post-harvest losses side, and different approach. There, of course, some technology, including how we track food and how we better store and stock supermarkets, but certainly includes behavioral change, dietary change at the consumer side.
Yes, you touched upon a very important point, behavioral change, and whether consumers will change their patterns of consumption, eat less meat, ride bicycles, avoid cars, a lot of other things that we can do that would help. But let's stay focused on food and agriculture and nutrition. Ms. Yuki, do you see any potential from the types of case studies that you've been dealing with, that we could introduce these combinations of advanced technology packages that would benefit the farmer and therefore bring about better things through the digital and the genetic revolution to reach these smallholder farmers?
Yes, actually, JICA is tackling to produce new genetic rice evaluation that can achieve the more high yield, and also to reduce the water usage. So I think it's very important to build new technologies, but more as important to build new technology is how we can show their benefit to farmers. And after we can show benefit to farmers themselves can use the technology by themselves, I think.
Indeed, that's very important. We're coming to the close of our session here, so unless somebody here has a very urgent question, we should really be wrapping up. In that case, let me wrap up. What you just said is very true. Swaminathan, who was very responsible also for the Green Revolution in India, when we spoke to him and we said, how did you manage to reach and get all the farmers of India to adopt the Green Revolution? And he said, no, they adopted it because from their perspective, they saw that it was more beneficial to them. These were better varieties of plants that were more productive, required less things. So this is very central, I think, to whatever we're talking about. But I think as both Umaleli, whose material was presented, and Mr. Tubielo have said, we have to realize that the food and agricultural sector deserves as much of our attention as energy. Whenever we talk about climate change, we're always talking about energy fossil fuels, etc. Yes, very important. Nobody denies that. But at the same time, if we are responsible for about 18 gigatons, which is about more than 35% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, and we have a sector that is so essential to people for food and nutrition, and at the same time, where there's about 30% wastage, both in terms of post-harvest losses and wastage to the consumer side, there's a lot of room for us to really think that this could be a very significant and important battle that could be won, where we can transform and reduce a very large part of the emissions, both of methane and of CO2, by moving from deforestation to reforestation, by moving towards climate-smart agriculture, by moving towards no-till and other techniques and soil management and integrated water, soil and nutrient management. We can do so much that benefits the poor, and that's very important. This is something that will benefit the poor and at the same time benefit humanity and the future generations. For those of us who have worked on that sector, we are passionate about it, and we believe that, yes, it can be done, and I think with determination, it must be done, and it will be done. And I thank you very much, all, each and every one. We are out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sargaldan, and all the speakers. This is the end of the non-CO2 GHG reduction.